Makosini Nkosi is a former NPA spokesperson and now an independent communications strategist. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the program. Let me start with you, Makosini, because if we go back to June 2005, you were the one that had to make the announcement that you were going to prosecute the president back then. It's been a decade later, plus later, and we're making the same decision. Take us back to that time and how it is that the NPA got to the decision that this man needs to be prosecuted.
You'll recall that in August 2003, then National Director of Public Prosecution, Bulelani Ngcuka, decided that he was not going to prosecute President Zuma, then Deputy President, but he was going to prosecute Schabir Shaik. We all know that the trial of Schabir Shaik took place around 2005, and he was found guilty on 3 charges. And that actually gave impetus to the decision that everybody thought was to be taken anyway. It was supposed to have been taken anyway in August of 2003. But you have a situation where a court of law had said that Schabir Shaik was found guilty of corruption. And there are 2 parties to corruption, the corruptor and the corruptee. So you had the corruptor having been found guilty, and the alleged corruptee, the person of President Jacob Zuma, was not charged. And it was a no-brainer that charges had to be brought against him. But however, the NPA needed to conduct further investigations because the investigations and the charges and all the evidence that was gathered was against Schabir Shaik. So the decision was taken in June of 2005. The National Director called me very early in the morning and said, please come early to work today. I think I was notorious for being late at work. When I arrived, he told me that, look, I've taken a decision to charge the former Deputy President. So we started a process then. I wrote a statement. We started a process that we were going to go through. First of all, the National Director was to see the Minister of Justice, who was at the time Bridget Mabandla, and from there proceed to see the President, who was at the time Thabo Mbeki. And after that, drive to Albert Luthuli House to see the former Deputy President, Jacob Zuma. And immediately after informing the former Deputy President, he called me and I addressed the press. What we were trying to do was to avoid leaks, because at the time there was suspicion between the NPA and the former Deputy President. Somebody was leaking information. The NPA thought the leaks were coming from President Zuma's side, and President Zuma's side was saying the leaks were coming from the NPA. So we wanted to eliminate that. In fact, indeed, we did have a very smooth announcement. And I can understand why Advocate Shaun Abrahams says he doesn't want to answer questions. That's precisely why, as spokesperson of the National Prosecuting Authority, I made the announcement, because I could answer questions without jeopardizing the case, and we thought that it wasn't going to be prudent for the National Director of Public Prosecutions to make that announcement, because if there are complaints, they still must be sent to him, and he must make a decision as to whether he yields to that or not. Are you saying that it might have been a better thing for the spokesperson to make the announcement today? Look, I think if you look at how far we have come with this matter, I think leaving it to the spokesperson would have been a bit tacky. I think we needed to hear the head of the organization himself, the National Director himself, speak, and I think it was a good decision on his part not to take questions from the media. All right.
And also, I guess, considering the allegations that that the NDPP is facing at the time, and the High Court ruling about his integrity as well, that he must be seen to be the one who has finally taken a decision and stand in front of the nation and say that this is the decision that I've finally taken. Yes. But then you must then take questions. You can't appear and say that I'm finally standing up and I'm explaining why I'm doing it, but then you must take questions. I suppose he's more worried about his own tenure, and that's where the questions will become difficult. Look, I think it's the NPA has placed itself in a very difficult situation. I mean, I was just looking at again the survey that we conducted at the Nation's Voice, which we did in conjunction with Us Africa and the University of Pretoria. We found that amongst independent institutions, people regard the NPA as the 3rd least trustworthy organization. Wow.
And during my time, or let me say during Vusi Pikoli's time, the NPA's reputation and trust was much higher than that. And I think that situation is not by accident. It has been earned by the NPA. If you look at the decision first that they took to drop the charges without taking the matter to court, and the long toing and froing appeals and all that around the spy tapes, Advocate Shaun Abrahams unfortunately has not projected himself as an independent person. And here is the problem, Peter and New Aldrin. I am almost 90% sure that the decision is going to be that we are prosecuting. But this is what it communicates to the people out there. When President Zuma was in charge, he was not being charged. Now he's no longer president, now he's being charged. Again now, it may unfairly perhaps send a message that it is now Cyril Ramaphosa controlling the NPA to go after the former president. So if the former president could control the NPA, it means the current president can also control.
The same power.
Yes, and I think that's where the government of South Africa needs to be very, very careful how they manage the perceptions around this, because if they don't manage them very well, what you're going to see is inevitably when the former president goes to court, people will be out there, ventilating.
We're going to talk a little bit about how the NPA can resurrect itself, and perhaps even how an NPA director is chosen just now. But I want to go back to that time, 2005, going forwards. There was a political drama playing out at the same time, wasn't there, Aldrin? And I suppose, you can't make decisions in a vacuum. And perhaps that these political forces must have influence at the time. Take us back to that time and give us a sense of what was happening politically. Deputy President Zuma was on his way to becoming president, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, certainly. Remember that the ANC's conference was coming up 2 years later. But quite interesting what Makosini is saying now is that if you look at Shaun Abrahams' conduct now, in between the past 3 years or so as NDPP, and not prosecuting Jacob Zuma, now that Jacob Zuma is not president of the country, now is being prosecuted. But that's the exact same spot that Jacob Zuma was back in 2005. He was deputy president of the country. There was this case that was hanging above his head because back then, even then, Bulelani Ngcuka said that there's a prima facie case against the president, the deputy president at the time, but they will not be charging the president. They will only be going after Shabir Sheikh, his financial advisor. But it's only after Thabo Mbeki had taken the decision to fire Jacob Zuma, who was then the deputy president of the country, then did the NPA come out and say that now we are prosecuting this person. It also speaks to this issue around what you're speaking about, the issue around political interference. Is there political interference? And I guess, Makosini, I hope we could put this question to you. At the time in 2005, was there political interference?
Look, I can only speak to what I know. And when the prosecuting team came back after the victory against Shabir Sheikh, they sat down with the national director. And what Vusi Pikoli asked them was one question: do you have a prosecutable case? Do you have a case that can sustain a prosecution? And they said yes. So he took time, of course, to make the decision. And in the intervening period, President Mbeki fired the former deputy president. And Aldrin is right. When we came back after that to charge him, we were dealing now with a lot of credibility issues that we had to face. One of those was that when the former president went to, I think it was, but it was Southern America somewhere, Latin America, and the national director happened to be there as well. And there was the narrative that perhaps the decision was taken in Chile, and after that the national director came back to prosecute. But throughout all the time that I was in the NPA, that was from October 2003 to January 2007, I never once heard somebody say the president has said we must do this. I never heard anything, I never saw anything.
Were you immune to the political conversations that were taking place? So you literally went into your office and did your work, even though all of these things were taking place? Because you said at the time that it was one of the most difficult times for you personally, wasn't it? Because your life was threatened.
Let me tell you what happened. First of all, I was working here at the SABC until 2003 as a political reporter, and I covered the former president Nelson Mandela. I covered the then current president Thabo Mbeki and deputy president Jacob Zuma. So I had a good relationship with him, as good a relationship as a journalist can have with a politician. And when the decision to prosecute was taken, and again, I took my direction from the national director, who was a man who took his oath of office very seriously, and that's what he communicated to us, and he drilled in us all the time that we have to do what is right. It doesn't matter what everybody is saying around us. And it was only around 2006 that I realized that the situation was very, very dire, because then the NPA hired bodyguards for me. But I left and I worked in the private sector 2007 up to 2009. When I left, nobody would touch me with a 10-foot pole. I sat at home for 2 years from 2009 up to 2011. And it's not because somebody said, don't hire him or don't do anything like that, but people had that fear that,
if they attach themselves to you.
You have got the man who was being prosecuted now is the president. Maybe let us not, get ourselves involved and send a message that we are against the president. So it affected many people. It's not just me. It affected Bulelani Nguga. It affected Vusi Pikoli, who was at some point asked to leave his job. He had to find...
Might the same happen to Shaun Abrahams post this?
I think if anything of the sort happens to Shaun Abrahams, it will be because he has lost credibility. I'm not going to say he deserves to have lost credibility, but if you are going all the time, you are caricatured as a sheep, Shaun the sheep. You are completely impotent. You can't take any decision. You are like someone who's bound, whose hands are bound. So I think that could be the result of him being seen that way, and not necessarily that he is seen as somebody who's independent, who's taken an unpopular decision.
Right. This is a really scary thought, just listening to Makosini speak about the experience post working for the NPA.
Yes.
Because if you look through the court papers that have been filed by the former NPA boss, Mxolisi Nxasana.
Yes.
He speaks about a moment where, this was said actually in the Constitutional Court. His legal counsel was saying this, that after he had left his job, of course, President Jacob Zuma, then he had a conversation with President Jacob Zuma, and President Jacob Zuma at the time then told him that I was scared that you were going to prosecute me, and I had to, get rid of you. Those are not the exact words that were used, but the intention was to get rid of you. So then, of course, Mxolisi Nxasana is not the NDPP anymore. But then when CASAC came with the case, trying to get him reinstated and trying to get Shaun Abrahams removed, they went to Mxolisi Nxasana and spoke to him about why he stepped down. And he said that he stepped down under duress, and he just decided that, listen, I need to step down. But of course, there is this issue around the 17 million rand. And President Jacob Zuma then in his court papers made the argument and said that I didn't push him out. He said that he wanted to leave. And when Michael Hali, this is now according to Mxolisi Nxasana, when Michael Hali, former President Jacob Zuma's lawyer, then went to go meet with Mxolisi Nxasana to speak about what information he would give to the court if he's asked to submit information or affidavit about why he resigned. And he said that I will speak the truth, that I was pushed out, and I have records to that effect. Those records were with Mxolisi Nxasana's lawyers. Mxolisi Nxasana's lawyer's office was broken into. And he was like, how could this have happened? Is it pure coincidence that only after I've said that I do have records and these records are with my lawyers and in my lawyer's office, those offices get broken into and those documents disappeared? But he says, luckily for him though, he had copies. He had copies of the records and the communication that he had with the former president.
All right. So, there's so much to discuss, so much ground to cover, but I did start in 2005. This journey has been quite long, 13 years. the defenses that the president has put forward to keep kicking this can down the road. Take us through some of the legal moments that he had and some of the representations that he's made up until now to try and defend himself. And he still has probably the biggest battle of his life to come. But take us through that journey.
Well, yes, it has been a long journey. At some point, when Vusi Pigoli had taken the decision then to prosecute President Jacob Zuma, I think it was a high court in Pietermaritzburg, if I'm not mistaken, yes, that's found that the prosecution at the time was not ready to prosecute, and then set aside the prosecution. So that meant that they had to go back. A new prosecution team then came in. This is now under Koterim Pse, whether to reinstate the charges or not. And this was, of course, during this heightened political tension that was happening in the country, where you had the president at the time, Thabo Mbeki, contesting former deputy president Jacob Zuma, or who was the deputy president of the ANC and trying to become the president of the ANC. The Polokwane conference in 2007 was coming up. And there was this whole issue around when do we serve the indictment against the president? Do we serve the indictment against the, well, then deputy president of the ANC? Do we serve the indictment before the conference, or do we serve the indictment after the Polokwane conference? And I think it was Justice Minister Bridget Mabandla, if I'm not mistaken, who had some issues around serving the indictment before, and made the argument that this would seem to be political, that there could be political interference, and you'd want to sway the outcome of the conference. And this, of course, then came out that what we now call the spy tapes, the conversation that Bulelani Ngcuka, as well as and Leonard McCarthy had, the conversation that they had around when to serve the indictment. And just based on that conversation that was had, even after the NPA had now decided to prosecute the now president of the ANC in 2009, when Michael Harley then served the NPA during representations with this recording, and now the Supreme Court of Appeal has raised issues around the credibility of that recording, and saying that Mshe didn't even look into the authenticity of the recording, but that was used as a basis to drop the charges against against the president of the ANC, who was in line to become the president of the country. And of course, after that, the DA then started relentlessly fighting to get access to these tapes and arguing that the merits that were used to drop the charges were not strong enough. And this was only based on the conversation. Nothing up until last year's court ruling, the Supreme Court of Appeal, that it was actually found, out of all these litigations that have been taking place, that it was found that a wrong section of the Constitution was used to drop the case. So the facts have always been there, and we know for a matter of fact this is the section that Mkoterim had used to drop the charges, but that section was wrong. And all counsel had to concede, including the NPA and President Jacob Zuma's counsel at the time, that in actual fact, a wrong law was used. And this means that we now need to go back, and a legal, rational decision will now have to be taken.
Using the wrong section. I mean, you know, we as the public have to believe that the most senior person at the NPA knows the law and knows it well. What are we to infer on that? Was it done? Do you start with the result and then find the law to get you there?
You're quite right. Look, I think let's look at the political environment that obtained at the time. President Zuma had just been elected president of the ANC, and you become the president of the ANC, you become the most powerful man in the country. The acting National Director of Public Prosecutions would either want to be confirmed as a National Director of Public Prosecutions, or they would want to be a judge, or anything to that effect. But also you can see this momentum that is Jacob Zuma. You can see this tsunami, as Zolinzi Mavavi said. You can see this tsunami that's unstoppable. And to many people, I think they had already been, even amongst members of the public. And also, I think it's important for us to remember that the media, more than anybody, had already, I think, in the many journalists and many media houses had moved beyond the prosecution that this man is going to be president. I think there was a general mood in the country that maybe perhaps let bygones be bygones. And if you are a prosecutor having to take that decision, being swayed by public opinion and being swayed by the political environment, you take a decision that turned out in the end to have been wrong in law and in fact, and that there is nothing about it that can be redeemed. So clearly this was a decision that was informed by the political circumstances at the time.
Right. I'm going to interrupt because it looks like Shaun Abrahams is now sitting at the table at the NPA headquarters in Pretoria. The microphone is going to be handed over, it looks like, to the spokesperson there.